History paints Alexander Hamilton as an innocent orphan child who, through a series of extraordinary events and his own hard work and seemingly natural brilliance, became one of the most successful and well-known founding fathers. However, Alexander Hamilton's success may have really been the pre-planned product of sinister forces, of what some refer to as the Club. Allow me to share with you all my evidence and exactly how I came about it. So, I was originally going to make this video about the Federalist Papers that Hamilton authored. I was going to show how the rhetoric Hamilton uses in the Federalist Papers is very similar to rhetoric we see our politicians using today. And I wanted to show how manipulative Hamilton was in the Federalist Papers. I wanted to break down his manipulation. And I was going to use the Federalist Papers to show that he was working for the club. But then I decided I should start the video off with some background information about Hamilton. So I visited his Wikipedia page and I came across some information that smelled very fishy to me. So I decided to pursue it, and by the end of my pursuit, I realized I had stumbled across a rabbit hole I had never heard about before. So I decided to make this video about my journey and to see what others thought about it. Our journey begins on the Alexander Hamilton Wikipedia page, because like I said, I came over to this Wikipedia page to find some information about him that I thought would be useful to share at the beginning of the video I had planned out. So when I was reading about him on this Wikipedia page, I came across this line in the second paragraph. It says, Hamilton was born out of wedlock in Charleston, Nevis. He was orphaned as a child and taken in by a prosperous merchant. And when I read that, I was very curious as to who this prosperous merchant was. So, because there's no link there it just says prosperous merchant, it doesn't link to any other Wikipedia page, and it doesn't give any name. Maybe it gives a name later on in the Wikipedia page, but I didn't look. Right here, at that point, I kind of stopped, and I decided to look for who this prosperous merchant was on my own. So after doing some searching, I came across this People magazine article titled From Orphan to Founding Father, The Life of Alexander Hamilton as Movie Hits Disney+. And most of the article is actually completely useless. The article does include something that's a little interesting, and it kind of conflicts with information that I'm going to share later on, and that is that after he became an orphan, he was actually with his older brother James Jr., and that they were later adopted by his cousin Peter Lytton, and then this guy Lytton actually committed suicide, and then the brothers were separated, and then something happened after. So this is actually very interesting that this is included in this article, because it's definitely going to pertain to information that I share later, especially this supposed suicide. So the interesting information, or actually the information, it's not really interesting, but the information in this article that led me to my next bit of information actually comes from this section titled Poetic Justice. And it basically talks about how Hamilton became discovered after writing a poem about a hurricane that ravaged the island he was on in 1772. And then it's like the poem later published in the Royal Danish American Gazette was so impressive to readers that a scholarship fund for his education was organized by generous benefactors. So right here, this is really important, because they're claiming that, okay, he wrote this poem in this newspaper, or at least it was published in this newspaper, and this started a scholarship fund specifically for him, by generous benefactors. So, so I click on that, right? So I click on the Royal Danish American Gazette, because fortunately they have a link to that. So that link will bring you to the article that he supposedly wrote. And of course, it's a very well-written article. I mean, you got to be amazed, though. In 1772, I think he was like maybe 15, maybe 14 years old when he supposedly wrote this. So very impressive for a young man of that age. So the important information, though, is not really the article itself. It's the information at the end of the article. So it says that this letter is preceded by the following statement, and this is a statement that it was followed by. So it says, the following letter was written the week after the late hurricane by a youth of this island to his father. So this is very interesting. His father supposedly left him, supposedly abandoned him. But this claims that he wrote this letter to his father, so he must have been in some contact with his father or something. The copy of it fell by accident into the hands of a gentleman who, being pleased with it himself, shewed it to the others to whom it gave equal satisfaction, and who all agreed that it might not prove unentertaining to the public. The author's modesty in long refusing to submit it to the public view is the reason of its making its appearance so late as it now does. So that's very interesting, okay, the claims being made here. So one claim is that it's showing up so late because the author of it is just such a modest person that he actually wasn't really concerned with having it published. It was a personal letter. He wrote this letter with no intention to share with the public. You know, this is not a publicity stunt. They have to make this very clear. And then another thing is that it fell by accident into the hands of a gentleman, right? So at the time that this letter was written, H's father was living on St. Kitts. I think H is Hamilton's father. So they knew where his father was. Very interesting. The gentleman referred to in the preceding paragraph was Hugh Knox, a Presbyterian minister who had come to St. Krueger in 1772. Knox was also an apothecary and sometimes journalist who edited the local paper when the regular editor had to be absent from the island. So another very interesting admittance here. So the gentleman who supposedly found this letter by accident, he's also an editor of this paper. So he got the letter published. You know, that's why the letter was published. So who is this Hugh Knox? So that was the next step I had to do. I had to find out who Hugh Knox was, or however you pronounce his name. So I typed into Google Hugh Knox, and I came across this link here, Mentors, a biography of Alexander Hamilton. So I clicked on that, and it's a biography of Alexander Hamilton. You know, this is the link to it. It has all these different links. This is the link under Mentors. So it's 1768 to 1773. And it says, oddly, after his family situation had disintegrated, Alexander's life seemed to improve immensely. His experience as bookkeeper in his mother's store landed him a job as a clerk with the international trading firm of Nicholas Krueger, a New Yorker whose business hub was on St. Croix, or I honestly don't know how you pronounce that name. I could be pronouncing it completely incorrectly. It goes on to say, the boy's exceptional skills and endless learning capacity soon saw him running the firm upon the owner's absence. I'm curious as to how quick this happened. You know, he's just running the firm, really. I mean, at this point, he must have been, like, 12 years old or something? But anyway, I guess things were different back then, right? So, as a teenager, Hamilton was inspecting cargoes, advising ship's captains, and preparing bills of lading. Under Krueger's tutelage, Hamilton mastered the intricacies of global finance and experienced firsthand how the material interest of peoples and countries interwove in the complicated fabric of international trade. The bustling port of St. Croix, which was a melting pot of residents and visitors from all over the world, early formed a picture of global village in Hamilton's mind. Look at that global village. What's a global village, guys? Curious. Would the New World Order be referred to as a global village? Whatever. He also saw the darker side of international dealings, as the island was a center for the slave trade. Hamilton came away with a deep hatred of slavery, and he eventually co-founded an abolitionist society in New York. In the meantime, the youngster drank in everything he saw. Nothing Hamilton experienced ever went unused. And then it goes on to say, Whereas Nicholas Krueger exposed Alexander Hamilton to material realities, the Reverend Hugh Knox provided him with a strong spiritual and intellectual grounding. Knox, who took Hamilton under his wing shortly after Rachel's death, was a Scottish Presbyterian minister at odds with the mainstream of his faith because of, actually, I have to stop. I can't, because that whole other thing, I have to say something else about that. So just amazing, right? So this Hugh Knox guy, he didn't accidentally find this paper Hamilton wrote. I mean, come on. He took Hamilton under his wing shortly after his mother died. Okay, I don't even know if Hamilton wrote that paper because this guy Knox, he was a columnist himself. We're gonna see that later on. So I mean, definitely some smoke here, right? You know, where there's smoke, there is fire. So there's some smoke here. There was no accident. Just wait till you guys see who this guy Nicholas Krueger. Wait till you see who he is. Okay, there's a huge conspiracy going on here. Okay, I mean, maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm just seeing it myself. But you guys tell me what you think at the end. Okay. But before we figure out who Nicholas Krueger was, let's really look at who this guy Hugh Knox was, because it's going to tell us who he is right here, right? So Knox, who took Hamilton under his wing shortly after Rachel's death, was a Scottish Presbyterian minister at odds with the mainstream of his faith because of his firm belief in free will over the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. I have to read that very slow because it's so super freaking important. Okay, Scottish Presbyterian minister, okay? Scottish rite of Freemasonry, question mark? Maybe, just possibly. Okay, but then it's kind of confirmed with this, what it says here. He was at odds with the mainstream of his faith because of his firm belief in free will. Who else pushes free will? See, the thing is, I know people will say, and like that's what's so screwed up, that's the mental twist that we find ourselves in, is that the misunderstanding of free will. And even here, because it says, his firm belief in free will over the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. See, Calvinists, they have a doctrine of predestination, but if you really look into Calvinist doctrine, and there's not just Calvinist, because Calvinism is actually made up of the writings of a bunch of different spiritual philosophers. This right here, this thing is actually a contradiction. Calvinists believe in free will, but it's his firm belief in free will. See, the thing is, he had this extreme belief in free will. I mean, there's this whole other thing. I would have to make a whole separate video to explain how actually this Calvinist doctrine of predestination was actually a huge danger to the club. Because this Calvinist doctrine of predestination is actually a big reason as to why the King of England had to send the Puritans and these other people out of Europe and to America. You know, they were pushed out of England and they were getting pushed around Europe because they had this doctrine of predestination, which basically some of them were advocating, some of them were basically saying that the King of England was wrong, the church was wrong. I mean, these people, their doctrine, if you really study it and you really understand it, it's actually one of the greatest threats to the New World Order agenda, because it's a spiritual philosophy that's actually very enlightened, and you can actually use this for a religious exemption for the whole mandate. Of course, they'll reject it anyway, but there's actually a religious exemption here. Like, right now, a big part of the religious exemption that they use has to do with the ingredients. They try to say, oh, the ingredients have fetal cells in it or whatever, aborted fetal cells. And of course, that can be easily bypassed by them saying, oh, there's a different ingredient in it. But this Calvinist doctrine of predestination, if you really understand it, it makes any attempt to control things basically against divine providence, against like God's rule. So basically, these religious people, these religious philosophers, they were saying that the church was wrong because they were violating this doctrine of predestination, and they were violating free will. And anyway, that's a really important topic, though. And basically what I want to say is that basically this makes this guy a Satanist. I'm going to come out and say it. It sounds fucked up because it's like, oh, what about free will? But basically, this guy is a Satanist. This guy who groomed Alexander Hamilton, this one guy at least, one of the two guys who groomed him, is a Satanist. And of course, like, people will have great things to say about this guy. Like, this guy Knox, if you look him up, he was like a super great guy. He was helpful to both private and public people. Like, he wasn't a big spender. Like, he gave a lot of his money to the community and to the cause. So, but he's a Satanist. So anyway, let me return to the main point. So for someone like Hamilton, who was otherwise predestined to a life of obscurity, we can see how Knox's philosophy would have appealed to him. The Reverend's encouragement and influence undoubtedly led Hamilton to dream big dreams. Knox, a brilliant sermon writer and occasional doctor, took the young orphan under his wing and tutored him in the humanities and sciences. When he was able to get away from the office, Hamilton further expanded his intellect in Knox's library, where he read voluminously in the classics, literature, and history. Hamilton, who had fancied himself a writer, published an occasional poem in the local paper and impressed the residents of the island with a particularly vivid and florid account of a hurricane in 1772. So all of this material is also very important because it's telling us that this poem that made Hamilton famous, it wasn't his first poem. And not only was it not his first poem, but it also tells us that Knox was what? He was a brilliant sermon writer. So I believe that Knox actually wrote this thing for the paper, published it in his own paper under Hamilton's name to, like, basically accumulate more money, to send Hamilton away under the guise that Hamilton was like a genius, that he was like some child prodigy. And then it later tells us that by 1773, his mentors had raised enough money to send him to America to continue his education. See, that's under the guise, his education. It was clear to all who encountered the young man that he was much too brilliant and determined to remain in what Hamilton himself termed, quote, the groveling condition of a clerk. Krueger, Knox, and other wealthy islanders sent Hamilton off in June of 1773 to New York to study medicine, most likely in the hope that he would return to the island and set up his practice there. But Alexander Hamilton was never to see the West Indies again. So it's under this whole guise, like, you know, well, this is at least what I believe, is that they're like, yeah, we're gonna send him over there to become a doctor. But no, they sent him over here specifically, well, they specifically groomed him, I believe, for a purpose. And that was to be a sophist of sorts, at least. So if you look up more about Knox, and I came across this article, The Death, Obituary, and Last Will and Testament of Hugh Knox, Mentor to Alexander Hamilton. And it says this. It says, Hugh Knox is most famous for having advised a 15-year-old Alexander Hamilton on St. Crux to go to America, i.e. the future United States, and, quote, having recommended Hamilton to some of my old friends there. So Knox is actually quoted as saying that not only did he send Hamilton, oh, by the way, Hamilton being 15 years old here, it's actually contested as to how old he really was. So Hamilton, if you look up his age, it's contested by 2 years. Some believe that he lied about his age. I'm not sure if he lied about being younger or if he lied about being older. So I'm not sure if he was really 15 here or 17. Maybe they sent him there as like a youth, you know, it's like, yeah, he's still young, yeah. Or maybe they sent him there like he's older than he really is, and they're like, yeah, he's young, you know, give him some entry-level positions, which is, I think, more the case. They wanted him to be younger so that he can, you know, reach a certain crowd and get certain positions. But of course, he's well overqualified because he has 2 years more experience than all the other 15-year-olds he's around. So this guy Knox recommended Hamilton to his friends. And of course, you know, it's right there. And now I'm going to try to complete this puzzle by returning back to Nicholas Krueger. And all we need to know about Nicholas Krueger is, In the Revolutionary War, Nicholas Krueger contributed generously to the colonial cause. So both of the people who raised Hamilton were revolutionaries. They didn't send him to America to pursue his education. And most importantly, the play Hamilton. I of course looked into this play Hamilton because I was trying to do my research well. I wanted to see what the propaganda was saying about him now. And of course, Hamilton, they have the star here, the upside down Baphomet symbol. So, but that's not important. But Hamilton, in Act 1, the third song, actually, My Shot, it has this line. And My Shot, of course, this song is when Hamilton impresses these group of men. Hamilton meets Aaron Burr, John Laurens, the Marquez de Lafayette, and Hercules Mulligan. So Hamilton meets these guys. Yeah, like I don't know how they present him meeting them. I'm sure that they present it as some accident. And he impresses them with his rhetorical skills. And they have the song My Shot. And in this song, they have this line. What are the odds the gods would put us all in one spot? So this line from the popular musical Hamilton makes it as if it was an accident, or like, what are the odds that Hamilton would meet these men? Well, the chances aren't that great because Alexander Hamilton was sent there to meet them by Hugh Knox. Remember, Hugh Knox said that he recommended some of his old friends to Alexander Hamilton before sending him there. So clearly this whole thing, it was no accident. And of course, this actually goes much deeper, or at least I believe it goes much deeper. It even goes into the position that Alexander Hamilton had in the Revolutionary War. In the Revolutionary War, he was an artillery officer, and this is a relatively cushy position. It's not like an infantryman. As an artillery officer, he's kind of back in the artillery, and he's kind of directing the artillery where to fire. It's a pretty cushy job for an army position, at least. Relatively cushy. And then what happened was he was actually taken out of the battlefield because he was made George Washington's official aide or whatever. And then he comes back into the war just in time to make a name for himself at the Battle of Yorktown. So I mean, the whole thing, it's very fishy. It goes very deep, and it's incredibly fucked up. And I just want to say, I make videos like this not to terrify people or to make people feel disempowered. I make videos like this, I point out shills like this to actually empower my audience. I want my audience to realize how vigilant we have to be when dealing with this group, with this club. We can't allow ourselves to be triggered into acting the way that they want us to act. These people are very smart, okay? They understand how our psychology works better than most of us understand how our psychology works. So they know how to goose step us into their traps. They know how to psychologically manipulate us into doing exactly what they want us to do. None of it is an accident. These people are incredibly calculated, and thus we ourselves have to be incredibly calculated and organized in return.